Yeah. I'm waving people. Come on in. Sit down. Good morning. What? Yeah, just telling. Well, no, they're coming in. As they're coming in, I'm having them move forward. It's good. Make it more cozy. Good morning. What a pleasure to introduce you to our first Distinguished Visiting Lecturer presentation of 2019. And we couldn't have really a more distinguished presenter than a member of our own university faculty, Dr. Megan Gunnar. I'm going to tell you about all of Dr. Gunnar's accomplishments in a minute, but I wanted to add a personal note, which is when I first came as department chair, and I think I was attending a seminar in CNBD. I don't even remember where or when exactly it was. Within like my first month of being here, Megan immediately came up to me, introduced herself, offered advice and support, and just made me feel a part of a much larger community than just within psychiatry, even within the medical school. Of course, over the subsequent months, I've learned and one is already impressed before one comes here because the work that has gone on in CHD and in the CNBD is known around the world. But I've seen also how that work gets carried out here locally and the collaborative spirit with which it is undertaken. And I think, again, Megan, you get so much credit for what you've built with all. And this focus on development, neural development, social emotional development it is the heart of how we think about things in psychiatry, or how we're realizing that we need to think about things in psychiatry. And so again, we've been able to have some really wonderful dialogues, both about how to bring in new faculty who will continue to drive this vision forward of understanding developmental processes and their relevance to psychiatric illnesses and mental health. And we've actually been collaborating on some of that together. So it's been a very fruitful relationship. So Dr. Gunnar is the Regents Professor and Distinguished McKnight University Professor, and is also the Director of the Institute of Child Development and the Associate Director of the Center for Neurobehavioral Development here at our university. She received her PhD in developmental psychology with Eleanor Maccabee at Stanford University, and then went on to complete a postdoctoral fellowship in psychoneuroendocrinology at Stanford, working with Gig Levine. In 1979, she became an assistant professor here of developmental psychology and has continued to make her mark both here, locally, and internationally. Dr. Gunnar's career has been focused on studying how stress affects human brain and behavioral development, and the processes that help children regulate stress. What could be more relevant to us as a field? She's a recipient of Lifetime Achievement Awards from the American Psychological Association, Division 7, Development Focus, the Society for Research in Child Development, the Association for Psychological Sciences, and the International Society for Psychoneuroendocrinology. She's involved in many, many different research activities, but I would say the overall thrust of her work is to figure out how do you translate research findings in early development for use by policymakers, by practitioners, by families. And she also chairs the Research Advisory Council for the Minnesota Children's Museum and is a research advisor for the Greater Minneapolis Crisis Nursery. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Gunnar.
Thank you, Sophia. That was a really lovely introduction, and it's delightful to be here this morning. I don't know about you, I'm a little sleepy. It's this weather, right? How long did it take you to get home last night? I'm exhausted. Okay, it's lovely to be here to talk to you about some of the work that we've been doing on stress and the pubertal transition. I'm getting into puberty and adolescence. It's a fascinating period of development, and I know it's one that you all deal with quite a bit. So, Coles to Newcastle, right? Puberty is a time of tremendous transition. If you didn't know it from your work, you knew it because you lived through it at one point in your life. It's a period of time where there are heightened stresses for children. The issues of your body and how it's changing, and whether it's changing like your friend's body is changing. I love this period of time that is illustrated up here. These kids are all the same age, right? And yet they are at very different stages of maturation, and that can be anxiety provoking if you're too fast or too slow in that process. It's a period of time where peers become in your relationship with peers and how they evaluate you becomes so terribly important, and whether you're in or out with the in or out crowd, and indeed which crowd you're in or out with. Right? What is your identity? And then it's also a period of time when your academics begin to matter a lot more. They're beginning to determine where you will go in life. And for many children, under a lot of stress to perform academically well. Okay, so it is a period of time when even children with very safe backgrounds, with very normal developmental patterns, are experiencing more stresses and challenges. And it is also, of course, a period of time where we see an uptick in affective disorders and in other kinds of problems that kids have, risk-taking problems, etc. It's a period of time, risk, of course, and also great opportunity. Right? Kids are getting smarter and better and more capable of doing things, while at the same time they're struggling normatively with these issues. And then if you have children with other issues on top of that, this really becomes potentially a crisis tipping point. Okay, it is also, of course, a period of time when the steroid hormones, sex steroids produced by the gonads and also by the cortex of the adrenal glands, there is an androgen produced there, are influencing the way the brain is developing, and those steroid hormones are being activated and regulated So there's a neurobiological steroid neuroendocrine component, of course, a big one to puberty and its influence on the brain. Steroid hormones include also the hormone that I've spent my career studying, which is the hormone cortisol produced by the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal cortical axis. As other steroids hormones are going up during this period of time, we also see an increase in activity of the HPA axis. Possibly partly because you're seeing changes in binding globulins driven by other hormones, possibly for reasons that we simply do not understand yet. There's an increase in that, a temporary increase in the activity of that system. Much of that increase has to do with basal activity, but we've also discovered that the system reacts more when you first wake up. There is a thing called the cortisol awakening response. Your cortisol levels go up about 60% from the time you open your eyes until about 30 minutes or 45 minutes later, right? Nature knows that waking up and getting moving is going to require more of this hormone in order to function well. It does a lot of great things at that time. It preps you for the day. It gets you interested in carbohydrates, so you go out and look for food. All sorts of good things to wake up, but it also, we now know, is titrated a bit by how much challenge you anticipate that day. So if you wake up the morning that you're taking your med school exams, your cortisol awakening response is probably a tad bit higher. Okay? We are also discovering that with puberty, there is a change in the cortisol awakening response, especially for girls. And I'm going to show you the data here in a second. That may be particularly interesting because there is some evidence that the magnitude of that response is predictive of increased risk for affective disorder. So the fact that we're seeing this for girls and not for boys could be interesting. So this is what we're seeing here. This is a study I'm currently involved in, where we're seeing children from the ages of, in these data, the kids are 7 to 15 years of age. We are using nurses to determine their Tanner stages, their pubertal stage, and we find that for girls, their cortisol awakening response is correlated with their Tanner stage. So I've just graphed it here for you. Blue is you're in stage 1 or 2, you're just beginning. 3 is you're at the midpoint of puberty, and 4 and 5 are that you're getting near the end of that pubertal transition. And what you can see is there's this increase in the magnitude of that cortisol awakening response for girls, not so much for boys. What we see for both sexes, though, is an overall increase in levels when we engage them in a social challenge task. Many of you, and I know one of you in particular, knows the Trier social stress test very well because Katie Cullen uses it in her research. This is a task where you threaten the social self by having the individual get up in front of a group and give a speech, right? Next to death, public speaking is probably the most terrifying thing we know of, right? And what we tell the kids is that they are going to give a speech in front of 2 judges. They're going to be judged. They're going to be videotaped. A group of their peers will also be judging this speech. And then they give a 5-minute speech, and then they do 5 minutes of arithmetic subtracting from a high number where they're going to make a mistake. And then when they make a mistake, you say, wrong, start over. Okay?
Get anyone to do the study.
And they come in and they do it. Amazing. But we pay them. And what you can see here is these are 9 and 10-year-olds, the blue guys, and 15 and 16-year-olds. And what we're not actually seeing a greater response, which people argue you do, but we never see it in our hands, but the levels are higher. So you've got a more active system. It's producing more of this hormone, maybe reacting more when you're getting awakening. It's a period of transition for your stress system as well as your other steroid hormone systems. And that has led my group to 2 questions that I'm going to do for you today. And hopefully I've not bit not more than I can chew here. One of the things we're looking at is a question of, does the social regulation of the HPA axis, which is a powerful thing, does it change with puberty? And the second question we've begun to look at, is puberty a period of heightened plasticity where you can recalibrate that stress system? So now that it's opened up and it's more reactive and all things are changing in the brain, is that a period of opportunity as well as risk for recalibrating that system? So let's go to the first question. We know that relationships are critical regulators of stress for all of us throughout our lives, but they're especially important for children who cannot regulate stressful contexts on their own. And a variety of relationships are important, but especially relationships with your attachment figures. In fact, early in my career, one of the reasons, social relationships cut both ways. They're also the biggest source for stress for us, but I'm going to focus on the stress buffering side of it today. So early on in my career, part of what made my fame is that I discovered, my students and I discovered that when young children are in situations that should provoke a stress response, when they're going to the doctor and getting shots in both legs, when they are confronted by a live clown that pops in the door and wants to play with them, when they go visit Santa Claus or the Easter Bunny or any of these other things that can be terrifying for children, those kids who are frightened do not produce elevations in cortisol if they are able to maintain relationship and have access to a attachment figure with whom they have a secure relationship. It is as if what's happened during that first year is the parent has moved into the hypothalamus. Now you think about it, it's the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal cortical system, and Regina Sullivan, a wonderful rodent researcher, has beautiful data that is actually what's happening, is that the stress buffering is happening in the hypothalamus where norepinephrine is being blocked and you don't produce the elevation in court unless you remove that regulator and make that regulator not be available. So it's as if the parent moves into the hypothalamus and is there to provide this powerful regulation of the stress system. So even in children who look terrified, you're lowering that level of activation. This hormone is a very powerful hormone, has a lot of effects on brain development, is part of what will shape an act now, think later defensive brain. And kids are going through all sorts of strange things early in life. They're afraid of their dog or whatever. And they need to learn about those things. But you don't want the brain flooded with this hormone while they're doing it. So what we know from young children is they'll seek contact with their attachment figure. They'll feel safer, but they'll still be acting as if, you maybe took your kids to visit Santa Claus, and you might have had one that was afraid of Santa Claus, and just because you're there, that didn't make them less afraid of Santa Claus. But it did probably prevent them from having brain damage because of Santa Claus. Not that they would have brain damage. But in your presence, they might have been able to stay 20 feet away from Santa Claus and begin to study Santa Claus so that the next year when you go to see Santa Claus, they got it all sorted out, right? And so it allows children to be able to explore the environment while having that kind of protection. We began to wonder, how long does this last? We know as adults, when we are with our attachment figures, our spouses, they can be powerful regulators of our stress system, right, if the relationship is secure. So how long does it last with parents? Does it last into middle childhood? Kids they're spending a lot more time away from their parents, right? Is it still viable then? Does it last into adolescence? Will they ever leave home? Right? No. Does it last into adolescence? So we began to ask that question, and we used the Trier Social Stress Test, and this is how it maps out. You come in, there's 20 to 30 minutes where we just try to get the access to baseline, and then you have 5 minutes to prepare your talk. This is actually what triggers the stress response right here. I have more Trier people sitting out there in a corner. Then you give the speech for 5 minutes, and if you can't fill that 5 minutes, you are asked to continue. And then you do the math, and that's another 5 minutes. About 25 minutes after the start of all of this, you're at your peak cortisol response, and then you go through this period of recovery, okay? And we borrowed from Clemens Kirschbaum something he'd used with spouses, which was during this 5-minute period of time, and only during this time, you were either with your mother or your primary attachment figure, we did have some dads, or you're with an experimenter who is helping you prepare for your speech. Otherwise, that's the only difference in this whole thing, okay? And in the first study, which Cam Hostenar did for her dissertation, Hello, would you like to go there? We had 9 and 10-year-olds and 15 and 16-year-olds. And if we look at 9 and 10-year-olds, these are the ones who had that 5 minutes of prep, and then mom goes away. She's not there during the speech. No activation of the HPA axis. And the ones with the experimenter showed a nice little activation. And then we look at the 15, 16-year-olds. Cortisol levels are higher, and there's absolutely no effect of prepping with your mom. Okay? Now, we started having lots of fun discussions in my laboratory, right? Why did this happen? And my students knew exactly why it happened. It's learned from teen culture, they said. They learned that friends are in, parents are out. And so, this is a product of adolescent development, and with age, as you move through different, begin to spend more time with your friends, that's just what's going to happen. And I said, okay, that's interesting, but I wonder, I think it might be a little more biological than that. I wonder if we have evolved to kick our parents out of our hypothalamus with puberty, right? It's time for, you've got independent regulation really becomes much more important, or you will never leave home, right? So we pitted puberty against age. And like I said, I love this age period because you can have children of the same age who are at very different stages. And we borrowed from Ron Dahl, who had this technique. You contact the family, and you try to sample so that you have some older kids that are at earlier stages of puberty and some younger ones at later, and so that you sort of tear apart that correlation between puberty and age. And we got it down to about a 0.25 correlation so that we could put both of them into the same analysis, because otherwise, mostly you can't, right? So that's what we did, and we ran the same study. We brought them in, and we brought them in and we ran them through the Trier social stress test, with them being with the mom or a primary attachment figure or an experimenter, and we analyzed it by pubertal stage, but I'm graphing it here for you as if we were doing early versus later. So what you see up here, these kids are the same age as the ones that I'm going to show you down here. These are the guys who were in the first few stages of puberty, stage 1 or 2, and you can see that being with the parent knocked out the stress response. And these guys they were in stages 3 and 4, basically, because they were 11 to 14, and what you're seeing is there's no significant difference. Wasn't as high as before. So the age may have some element going on here, but it looked like puberty was the thing that was kicking the parent out of the hypothalamus. Okay. Then we came back and said, well, if you're losing this powerful divide, now you still derive some security from your parents. It's still emotionally good for you to talk things over with them, etc. You just don't have this powerful bio buffer from your contact with them. And it's interesting to me that this is also about the time, right, when we begin to see this uptick in affective disorders that are related to stress. So is this part of the story? That's something I have to go out and figure out, because I can only do so much. But I think it's fascinating and potential. But we started arguing again in my lab, like, if not parents, who? And my students knew the answer, right? Absolutely. It is friends are in, parents are out, so friends will become the buffer. And I said, it's an empirical question, guys, but do you remember your friendships when you were 12, 13, and 14? They aren't attachment relationships. They're friends, but they've got risk involved in them. But if it's an empirical question, we'll test it. And we ran another Trier social stress test. This was Jenna Doom's dissertation. And what we did was we brought a parent and a best friend in, always. So you always came in with your best friend and your parent. And then randomly, and you didn't know it until the time, you either prepared in that 5 minutes with your best friend or with your parent. But other than that, all the rest of the time, except for when you were actually doing the test, you were with your best friend and your parent. So your best friend is here. It's a different paradigm than we were running before. We got slightly different results. What we found is for the 9 and 10-year-olds, and it was 9 and 10 and 15 and 16, that we did. For the 9 and 10-year-olds, we're seeing a cortisol response now where we hadn't really seen one when they were with the parent. But remember, the peer is around, and it's a social evaluative stressor. So I think it just ramped up that sense of social evaluation to have your best friend there. And for the teens, having your best friend help you prepare made it the most stressful test. Guys, if you want to really stress them out, because it's a social evaluative stressor. And in our version of this, which was developed by Jody Quass, you are going to tell a new class something about yourself, some of the things that they'll like about you and maybe some of the things they won't. So here's your friend helping to evaluate you, right? And it really maxed all of this. We're in the process of designing some experiments and trying to get NICHD to let me do neuroimaging to see what's changing in the brain, but also to see how broad this impact of friends make it worse. I mean, if you go and you're going to get your ears pierced, has having your friend with you make it worse? That's a pain stressor. That's not a social evaluative stressor. Maybe that's different. Right? Maybe even parents work under that circumstance if you could convince them to let you get a tattoo and come with you, right? So do those kinds of stressors maybe operate differently? And we're trying to find out if you and your friend are both undergoing the same stressors, like you're both having to give a speech. Maybe having your friend with you there, you sharing the load, that may be different. So we're hoping NICHD will let an 11th percentile grant get funded. You can all say your prayers for me right now. And let's see, just a little interim summary. I need to make sure I know how much time I have. Parents in secure attachment relationships are really powerful buffers. Parents appear to remain powerful buffers at least until the midpoint in puberty, and their potency then decreases at least for social evaluative stressor contexts. Peers don't take over, at least in those kinds of contexts as far as we can see. Making early adolescence an interesting period of time in terms of stress and stress regulation. You may not be more stress reactive, but you may have less regulatory competence. You may have to be all on you. Okay. Now, much of my research has been involved with looking at early adversity. And I know many of you treat children who have experienced a lot of adversity in their lives. I've been studying children adopted from orphanages because they give me a model of lots of adversity in the first year or so of life, followed by some of the best the world has to offer in terms of well-resourced homes with families who really want them. And while they're not perfect parents, none of us are, they're probably as good as most of us. Okay, so actually maybe they're better than us because we do psychology. We're a little odd. At any rate, I've been studying these kids. We know that once they get to families, they actually form attachment relationships very quickly. And surprisingly, they're pretty secure relationships. There's some anomalies in them, but don't believe that they can't form attachment. They do. They show a lot of indiscriminate friendliness, but that ain't about attachment. That's about something else we've discovered. So at any rate, we've been studying these kids, and one of our questions was, if your parent can't move into your hypothalamus because they're not there in infancy, will they ever be able to provide that kind of buffering effect? And what we found is, and we know that we have a very atypical patterns of HPA axis functioning in children while they're in orphanages. They have a flat diurnal rhythm, pretty much. And we know that that actually is a reflection of chronic stress. We produced this paper in 2001, raising that possibility because everybody expects chronic stress means hyperactivity of the system. And now it's very well known through many, many studies that, in fact, hypocortisolism is what we primates do. We're not rats. We primates go hypo with chronic stress. Maybe the individuals who have depression don't, and that may be part of what gets you to depression, is you can't go hypo like the rest of us. At any rate, there's very good evidence now that hypo responding is what we see. And in children adopted from orphanages, we are able to show that this hypo responding, both diurnal rhythm and reactivity, in the first few years after you're adopted is a predictor in kindergarten of having externalizing problems and ADHD problems. Okay, so it's part of the story of the dysregulation of early adversity. So the question was, are they able to use their parent to regulate stress? Again, we use the pattern I've been showing you, mother versus experimenter. And it was in that same study. So some of these data you've actually already seen. These were the 9 and 10-year-olds that you saw with the mother or with the stranger that I showed you before. These are the post-institutionalized kids, and they're showing a response even when they're with the mums, and they don't look any different when they're with the stranger than the other kids. This is not a real difference. Maybe it is if I doubled the sample size, but that's not a significant difference. So what we were finding here is even though these children said and reported really positive relationships with their parents, and it was clear from our video that they were using them as a source of security, they weren't getting the the bang for their bio buck, right, on this. And that may be true of a lot of children who have a lot of adversity in their early relationships, even if they're in good relationships with the adults caring for them now. Another little piece to put into our puzzle. Okay, and there may be a sensitive period here because this is the same study I just showed you, and these are the kids who were under 18 months at the time they were adopted, and here they are with their mom versus the stranger, and these are the ones that were over 18 months. So that first 2 years, when you're forming your attachments and it's still pretty open, it may be there's a little time there if you get out and we correct relationships early, okay? So another brief little summary, attachment figures. Parents provide powerful buffers of the neuroendocrine stress system throughout infancy and childhood, and for children who did not have the opportunity to form those relationships in infancy, the social relationships may not provide them with as much biological bang for their buck. Okay, puberty. My watch stopped. That's really not helpful. It's only 10 to 7. What? Thank you very much. Okay, we're on time. How did that watch stop? Whatever, I need a new one. Okay, back to puberty. And I've been thinking a lot about this idea that with puberty, we are going through lots of transitions. The HPA axis, I hope I've convinced you of that. There are other changes. Periods of transition are also periods of plasticity, are times of risk because we might be able to train the axis to be a hyper-defensive stress system, and that's usually what we think about, right? So adolescence might be a time when if bad things happen, they're going to have a much longer impact than if it happened in childhood or adulthood. But it cuts both ways. And so that might also be a period of time where if we can reduce the harshness for the kids who have started out in harsh conditions, maybe they have an opportunity to recalibrate back to something that looks more typical of a child who was raised under less harsh conditions. And that's the side of this I've been trying to look at with these children that were adopted from orphanages, because as I showed you, their system is pretty atypical, at least when they're kids. But will puberty allow it to recalibrate? That's the question. My favorite, let's keep terrifying them by giving speeches. The study that we're doing right now, the kids are 7 to 15 years of age. We see them 1 year later, and we see them 2 years later. We start them at different points. It's an accelerated longitudinal design where you're able to use fancy-dancy statistics to be able to map out 7 to what will ultimately be 17 years. They see nurses, we do the Tanner staging, they do 3 days of home cortisol collection to get that cortisol awakening response. Yes, some of that data I just showed you was the non-adopted kids, the kids raised in their birth families with the CAR. They do the Trier each time they come in. They do a stress interview that Karen Rudolph developed. The parents complete behavioral and emotional problems measures, and I'm going to show you just a little bit of the data from year 1 that we've analyzed and published. We've got the whole thing is done now. All the data are not in the hopper yet. We're still analyzing. We're still getting it coded and in. And then I'll be able to have a lot of fun. But this is what we see, again, analyzed by pubertal stage and analyzed continuously, but I'm showing to you as if we analyzed it in blocks. So these are the kids who are in stages 1 and 2 of puberty. These are the non-adopted kids. They're not with their mother. Okay, this is just like with an experimenter. This is not social buffering. This is trying to scare them half to death, right? And they're showing a very nice, they come in higher, they go down, this is baseline, then you do the Trier, and there you go. These are the kids adopted from orphanages. They come in, they go down, they go down, they go down. Okay, very blunted response. And that's similar to what Chuck Nelson has seen in his work in Bucharest, Romania, and so on. So these are pre-early puberty kids. And then this is what I see with the kids controlling for age. This is what I see for the kids who are mid to late puberty. And it looks like they are looking like kids who hadn't been through the ringer early on. So there may be this wonderful opportunity if we can move kids or get kids stable and in good situations before they get to puberty, to be able to use puberty as a tool to recalibrate their systems so that they are not showing this hypo-functioning. If things are good in that transition. That's why I have the stress interview, because I actually predict some of these kids are going to start looking worse. The ones where the stress interview indicates that things are still horrible for them, because their peers don't like them, because they're not doing well in school, all the kinds of things that can go wrong. But that we still have to look at. So, childhood adversity, perhaps especially deprivation and neglect, is associated with this low blunted cortisol activity in primates. I could have shown you a ton of monkey data too. There may be a sensitive period for calibrating the HPA axis in those first 2 years of life, where harsh conditions will lead to a downregulation in the axis that is maintained even when things get much, much better. But that hypofunctioning at puberty, maybe it's an opportunity for us there, if conditions are really good, to get kids' systems reorganized and on track. And overall, and we're going to have plenty of time for questions because I went faster than I thought I would. The pubertal transition is a period of risk and opportunity. Children seem to lose some of childhood effective buffers and stress regulatory mechanisms that may open them up for stress-related emotional problems and make that a higher risk period. On the other hand, the increased plasticity of the system may allow children to recalibrate from chronic stress into something that operates more normatively, all of which points to the critical importance of supporting healthy development during early adolescence as a very important target of our work. And it took 1 million people to do this work. And thank you. And we have loads of time, I think, for questions. I think we're going to hand around a mic.
I'll start. A couple of points. One, I understand that the onset of puberty in males is 11.2 and girls 9.2.
Yeah.
So the suggestion, I like your slide that says you're going to start with 7-year-olds. I think if you're looking at 9 to 10, you're looking at an average group of girls that may already be in puberty.
Yeah, we checked that they weren't beyond the midpoint of puberty.
Okay.
Okay, because that seems in the work that we're doing, that seems to be the dividing line. Stage 1 and 2, not so much. Beginning to see stuff happening in 3, 4, and 5, definitely.
So the second question is one I raised some time ago when I was doing research. When you're doing Tanner staging, I know from doing that 1 and 2 in boys is 1 is straight blonde hairs and 2 is curly blonde hairs. And that's really kind of tough.
Yeah.
The perhaps better way to do it is with the Prater beads, because
we do it.
So you do Prater beads as well?
Oh, we do the whole schmear. I mean, it's nurses doing this exam, and they have been trained by a pediatric endocrinologist.
Good.
So
that's
we're
what
doing.
I'm wondering is
yep.
Because I think for boys that's a more sensitive.
Yep.
At 3 cubic centimeters.
Totally. So no, we are doing actual Tanner staging with nurses, the whole thing, as you would do in a pediatric endocrine clinic.
And as long as I have the mic, what about thyroid and growth hormone axes? Do you look at those?
I don't look at thyroid and growth hormone axes. They're very interesting and important, but I have not been looking at them. They take, from my understanding, I would need blood.
Yep.
Right? And that puts a kibosh on a lot of research with kids. Now that I'm beginning to look at adolescents, though, by the time they're 15 and 16, if I pay them, they're very happy to give me blood, and their parents figure that they're old enough to decide whether they give blood. So we're doing more blood work, and we could add some of the work on growth hormone.
There is something known as darky, where at puberty the thyroid shifts over. And that's an old concept that goes back 15
I have to look into that.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Gunnar. I'm over here.
Hello.
Hey. Fantastic talk. You had made a comment about some of the socially indiscriminate behavior that you see in kids not being an attachment-based phenomenon. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Okay. Different talk, but there's plenty of time for me to give this other talk. So one of the things that is associated with poor attachment in kids living with the people that they are attached to, right, theoretically attached to, is this: if they go to any port in a storm kind of behavior. If you walk in and you're a stranger and they're in your lap and wanting to go home with you, et cetera, that is a sign there is something really not right in that attachment relationship. Okay. But that isn't true of children adopted from conditions of adversity where they did not have a secure person. So this has been profoundly misunderstood, and now all of us, Charlie Zena, Mike Rudder, myself, we're all on the same page on this, that if you do not formulate that attachment, there's the coming together of how you deal with strangers and how you deal with your attachment figure in the latter part of the first year of life. And you begin to hone in on your people and who aren't my people. This is, by the way, is happening in language, right? It's when you begin to organize and you no longer can use all of the sounds of language. You can only do your own. It's happening in face perception, where you used to be able to tell monkeys apart, and now you can only tell people apart. It's also happening in how you judge your distance to familiar and unfamiliar people and who you would go to for support. Kids who don't have the secure relationship then are not getting this sorted out right. But if they get to a family later and they are able to organize their behavior around the attachment figure, this thing about strangers still isn't organized. It doesn't all come together then. There was a time for it to happen and it didn't. And so what we see in these kids who are adopted from orphanages is often very secure-based behavior with their parents, and yet they still will walk up to strangers and be way too friendly. It was related to problems in the attachment system then, but it's not necessarily related to problems in the current attachment system. And that's been very, very difficult for many families who adopt kids who have been through the ringer, because they're being told that the child has an attachment disorder and is not attached to you. And that hurts. By the way, now in the new DSM, it's not called an attachment disorder. It's not disinhibited attachment. It's disinhibited social engagement disorder, right? That was Charlie Zena's word for it. But these are different phenomena. If it is your attachment figure that you grew up with, maybe not so different. But if this is someone you have now moved into a relationship with and you're feeling pretty safe with them, it still may not put a kibosh on that other behavior. Yeah, we got one here.
Thank you for an excellent talk.
Sure.
I'm losing my voice, so I apologize if you can't hear me well. I have a lot of interest in childhood adversity and how this is a footprint on people, particularly with regard to risk for development of psychiatric disorders in adulthood.
Yep.
And we recently published a paper showing that for people who have experienced high levels of childhood adversity, that by the time they're adults, they end up being more plastic, sort of more responsive to their environment across the board, both to stressors, but even to improvements in their environments. And I guess what I'm wondering with your work with cortisol is what you see in adults who have experienced adversity, and your sort of thoughts on how cortisol corresponds also to what we see in terms of psychiatric symptoms, or how that shapes sort of a subjective experience. Yeah.
Yeah, a small question. One of the things that is seen in adults who have experienced trauma, both trauma in childhood and in adulthood, is those who are not exhibiting a lot of signs of psychopathology still often show a hypofunctioning HPA axis. Okay, so that's the question. What is that hypofunctioning doing? Is it increasing the risk of PTSD and other kinds of problems, or is it our way, our species' way of protecting the brain from too much reactivity of the system? And is it actually functional? I don't think anybody really knows the answer to that yet. Certainly there is a good reason to have a nice reactive axis that's doing its thing. I don't know if individuals who are showing that hypofunctioning might be at greater risk for immune disorders, autoimmune disorders, and other sorts of things. On the other hand, nature hates, you never want to study endocrinology, ever, 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 because it's so bloody complicated. So the adrenal may be producing less cortisol, but you may have all sorts of other changes that are compensating for that, like a change in FKBP5, that maybe what cortisol is there is actually getting in better or whatever. And so it's dangerous to ever say, oh, well, this means that, without looking at all of the steps in between. And I can't do that in kids, so you get to do that. Because you can do things to adults I can't even think about doing.
Thank you.
So Megan, I'm excited to think about the window that you're talking in early adolescence is a social plasticity for those of us who do social targeted things like in autism.
Yep.
And critical and sensitive periods. And thinking about that. But it's interesting, you're making me think about paralleling it with the stress system as well as another period of social learning and how they could interact, which is very complex. Mm-hmm. But a broader question I have is you had those kids, 9 to 14, that some of them go through puberty early, some mm-hmm, don't. Mm-hmm. They're in these developmental cohorts.
Yes.
Longitudinal studies of individuals who go through puberty earlier versus later.
Yep.
We have some of the early stress, trauma stuff that suggests mm-hmm. that sometimes that triggers timing of puberty. What is the lasting effect of that shift that's happening at a very different time period for those kids
sure.
that might have it as early as 10 versus 15, and you're at it, and your brain is developing rapidly at that time as well.
Right. So in the work that we've done where we use that split, we don't have any that are really early or late, right? It's more that normative standard deviation. So set that aside. Your question is, boy, what really happens to the ones who are really hitting puberty way early? Is that an issue that we need to worry about in terms of the stress system, and way late? And I don't know the answer to that because I haven't studied those two groups. I've tried to avoid that because I was trying to answer another question. We certainly know that, there's been loads of study, as you know, about when you go into puberty and how that affects you. And if you're a boy, being early is actually sort of good because you make all the teams and, you've got the muscle needed and so forth and so on. And if you're a girl, that can be problematic, especially if, no one's locking you in a chamber so that you avoid being with those older boys and getting into trouble. So those are, the sort of normative findings. But in terms of how that works with the stress system, maybe I actually don't think I've seen much on that at all. And it would be a very good question. I do know that all of the hype about these kids from orphanages going into puberty early is wrong. We've proven that. That was based on flawed research where they asked parents to respond on the internet. The ones with kids that looked a little off time respond and all the others didn't bother. So with our Tanner staging, we've shown that they are not going into puberty early.
This is a little bit of a kind of a follow-up thought to something you're just now beginning to allude to. You know, I've found myself wondering if some of this, you started out by showing that in girls there's a little bit more hyperresponsivity in the system, and you know what's been floating around in the field for decades, right, is that there's something innate about being female, where this, particularly as one begins to enter puberty, that where there is a more sort of finely tuned stress responsivity system, and this increases the risk for anxiety and depressive disorders. But I have found myself wondering if some of that increased sensitivity of the system may not be, at least in part, environmentally driven. Because when girls are entering puberty, they're entering a time now in which the environment becomes much more dangerous to them. When boys enter puberty, they're becoming acquiring physical attributes where they become more masterful over the environment. Girls are becoming much less masterful in the environment. Has there been sort of work or thinking about that, so that this is not all endogenous?
Or not all exogenous, because one could make an evolutionary argument that has been true throughout evolution, and therefore the systems have adapted themselves to be able to reflect this division between the sexes in. Now remember, so I'm going to kibosh the evolutionary argument, because actually probably for males it's also a very heightened period of risk, because frequently you get booted into all male groups and off to the edge, and you know, if there's cannon fodder needed, you're it.
But there's still a sense of increased autonomy, kind of physical autonomy and power in the world. And for females, it's quite the opposite, right? Less autonomy, more actual
danger,
sexual danger.
Yeah. And that could that certainly is likely to be happening. How that is related to these cortisol awakening data, I don't know. We don't see girls being more reactive in the trier. It's this awakening response, and so it probably also needs to be replicated, because it could have just been a fluke finding. But if it's actual, it may be related to girls waking up and having more anticipatory anxiety about what's going to happen during their day. Or simply being more prepared for their day than boys is another possibility. Their executive functions are a little bit better. So, you know, if you're looking forward to your day, maybe that's different. We don't really understand it, but it's a really interesting question. We certainly have a strong sense that the defensive modes have to change, because the place in the world, in our culture, is going to be different. And then that begs for cross-cultural studies that might be different.
One other question, sort of implicit in particularly in some of the latter half of what you were presenting, is sort of this notion of resilience. So not just risk, but resilience. And I wonder if you could just riff a little bit on that in terms of, as people work clinically with adolescents, have you had any sort of thoughts about that in terms of interventions or kind of against, social policy implications?
Sure. I mean, I think when I look at the resilience side, to me it says, boy, this means that when kids are just about to go into adolescence, we ought to be targeting a lot of energy there. So that if you can walk into adolescence with good coping skills, better ability to work with peers, dealing with whatever is tripping you up, that's probably a really good thing, because this is a period of such plasticity, rather than waiting until the kids are in your offices having had terrible problems, right? So that, 5th and 6th grade would seem to be really an important period of time to be working on some of these skills that they'll need. That's the only big thought that I've had.
School curricula.
Right, and what you would be doing. Well, school curricula. What's the most important thing for kids is, can I get along with other kids?
Oh, I don't mean curriculum in the sense of a learning module, but there are now schools which are trying to promote, whether it's mindfulness techniques or healthy peer-to-peer communication techniques.
All of that is good, and really a good idea, especially at those ages. You'll need to continue it, right? But not waiting until you're sort of in a middle school crisis situation to be doing it. Yeah. Katie had a question. She hasn't had a chance yet.
Just quickly to follow up on your comment about the middle schools, my daughter's 12, and if she doesn't have a friend in her class, assigned to that class, it's a terrible class. She just, that's the most important thing, whether they have a friend in their class or someone to sit with at lunch, period. But since I have you here, Megan, I was wondering if you could help me think about something we've been learning in our research, which is in adolescents with depression. I've shared this with you before, and Bonnie published that this past year that that amongst all the kids with depression, it was the kids with NSSI that seemed to have a flattened.
NSSI.
Oh, non-suicidal self-injury. Seemed to be a subgroup where, the most, in general, they have like a higher response to the TRIR compared to controls, but the ones with this pattern of repetitive non-suicidal self-injury have this flattened response. And yes, that's related to, a history of, they do have more like, I'm pointing to Anna because she's presenting a poster on this soon, but they have more a history of adversity than the other group. But I think that's not the whole story, because like Charlie Nemiroff's group and others have shown that like depressed people with a history of early adversity have even higher TRIR responses.
Yeah.
So anyway, I've been just wondering if this behavior itself impacts the cortisol system.
It could. I once got a call from someone who studied multiple injuries in cats, and he was getting hypofunctioning. Those injuries are traumas. And they're not, the body, hello.
Yes.
Up from here, not down from there, is probably processing them as traumatic injury, and inflammatory reactions and so forth. So, yeah, I would
it's
actually
driving down the cortisol response. Yeah.
It's possible.
As an adaptive.
Well, and have you talked to Frank Simon? Because he studies.
I have, yes.
Yeah.
Not lately, though.
And really, he's trying to think about what's happening at the skin.
At the skin, yeah.
Yeah, level. So, we in psychology think that God put the system in the body for us to study as an output of our psychological processing. But actually, that's sort of an afterthought, and so much of the regulation and activation of the system is coming through the somatic activity.
Right.
And especially when you've done something to cause trauma to the physical corpus.
Over and over.
Over and over. You might want to, be thinking about what those pathways are doing in terms of talking to the axis.
Thank you. Oh, my neighbor has a question.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Gunnar. Very, very interesting talk.
Thank you.
I was just wondering, out of curiosity, with your data you got from, these children grown up in the orphanages, and, they have this hyperfunctioning, which definitely puts them at some risk later on in life, Is there any intervention, that you would suggest or that has gone into, children in orphanages? Because there definitely will be children in orphanages.
Yeah. So what interventions can we do? We've, we also notice that these kids have a lot of problems with attention and attention regulation. And we even tried our own little mindfulness intervention, which did seem to have some help, for them. So I think some of many of the interventions that we have for kids that have the same symptoms are ones that we could be using for them. And then, helping to support these family relationships so when there is the opportunity to recalibrate in puberty, things might go better for them health-wise. We are seeing, unfortunately, some really long-term health things happening for these kids, even those who are probably going through puberty and getting recalibrated. So with Erin Cully, we've been looking at the cardiovascular system, and with Chris Coe in Wisconsin at the immune system. And what we're seeing related to being in orphanages early in life is a shifting of the immune system towards immune senescence early on. So we're seeing an increase in T cells, CD8 cells, that are tagged with this thing called CD57, and it's a sign of senescence. I like to think of it as like these T cells are like little generals. They've been going out and fighting wars and getting medals for all the wars they fought, and after a while they can only fight the old wars, and they can't really get it up to fight a new kind of war. And they aren't there yet, but they're showing the signs of aging early, I guess is the best way to think of it. We're also seeing that in the cardiovascular system. So we're seeing evidence of stiffening of the arterial walls early. We're seeing evidence of elevated fasting cholesterol, incipient signs and these are in kids whose average age is 13. Even though they otherwise look beautifully healthy and they're not overweight. They're, if anything, thin. So there's, so much of my work argues that we can't wait. We need to really push and push and push on our society to be able to provide support for children early in life. We don't stop. You don't pack their bag and put them on the street corner at 3, but you can't also come in at 4, 5, and 6 and expect kids to be sort of free and clear of all sorts of things.
So in terms of translational, so you talked about norepinephrine being something that was hyperproduced, was too much.
No, I talked about norepinephrine being blocked in the hypothalamus
is part of the
a part of the buffering system.
Buffering.
It wasn't hyperproduced; it was just normatively produced.
So in post-traumatic stress disorder, norepinephrine is hyperproduced.
Yes.
One of the etiologies of ADHD is norepinephrine.
Yeah.
Norepinephrine and dopa. The treatment for ADHD includes things like clonidine, like guanfacine, like atomoxetine. Those things have all been proven to be helpful improving attention. And if you look at the PTSD literature, noradrenergic agents such as clonidine and guanfacine are very helpful. Is there any point in using guanfacine or clonidine in these kids who have this early problems? Because sometimes if I'm an inpatient child psychiatry, I'll see PTSD that's severe. And the point is, how do you treat that? And I think the answer is probably you look at the norepinephrine system and target that instead of trying the serotonergic system or the dopamine system.
Boy, you asked a question that's just way above my pay grade. Way above my pay grade. What is not entirely clear to me is the norepinephrine that's being produced within the hypothalamus, whether that has anything to do with the broader production of norepinephrine in the prefrontal cortex. And until I can figure that out, I don't know how to begin to answer your question.
All right.
There was one back here.
I think I'll defer mine. I think it was not a well-formulated enough comment or question.
Well, then I could give you a not formulated well enough answer.
Actually, since I know I'm speaking, maybe I'll just mention.
Sure.
I wonder about the subjective perspective on the parent's role as a buffer and how that transitions, what the kids and the adolescents say about that. When I was about 5, I started having a recurring dream that my head would fall off while I was sitting between my two parents watching the television. And they didn't notice, and so I'd go to the bathroom and I'd grab some Band-Aids and put it back on. And I would have this dream very frequently for several years. And starting pre-puberty, I started to interpret this as, my folks really can't help me with everything. And I wonder what the kids and adolescents, do you do some subjective work with them to figure out what they think of their folks?
No, I haven't, but that point is actually a good one, that at some point in your life, you realize your parents can't help you with everything. It actually starts earlier because your friends cannot make friends for you. Right, so the first time kids truly confront this is in preschool. They can make play dates for you, but they can't make other children like you. And so that's sort of the first competence that, boy, you have to take on yourself. You can complain to your parents about all these people that are not tight, Your parents can talk to you about maybe some strategies, but, if your friends are coming to your house because they think your mother's funny, it's not a good sign for you. I mean, if is your mom home? Sure, I'll come over. Not, I don't want her. This is not good, right? And so that's probably the first place where kids really and truly realize that there are limits to what my parent can do for me. And which is why I've been very interested in peer relations for a long time, and temperament and so on. Yeah.
I'm just wondering, Megan, thank you for a great talk. Yeah, as you were responding to some of these questions, the thought popped into my head, and I'm wondering if you are aware of any research out there on intergenerational trauma. We talked about early childhood trauma, but are we seeing these same effects on T cells and the adrenal effects of intergenerational trauma?
Rachel Yehuda.
Okay.
Right. I mean, she has been, she started her career by discovering that the offspring of, well, first of all, that PTSD was associated with hypo and not hypercortisol, and then she's done beautiful work on the intergenerational transmission of trauma in Holocaust victims, right? That this is now a cottage industry of not just Holocaust victims, but looking at intergenerational effects on telomere length, on immune functioning, and so forth and so on, and trying to understand what the epigenetic processes might be there. And it's, from my reading of it, it is complicated. It is extremely complicated. And we shouldn't be thinking that we're just epigenetically carrying it across generation after generation. It's probably much more complicated than that. But the questions are really interesting. One of the things, of course, that Rachel pointed out early on was that part of that transmission may have to do with being raised by someone who has been through so much trauma that your trauma just doesn't even register. So you come home and you complain that nobody likes you at school, and your mother's response is, when I was your age. Yeah. And that kind of dysregulation in the relationship may be also a component of that transmission. So we shouldn't immediately jump to lovely biological things. Yep. Great. Thank you very much. Thank you.
You have been disconnected from the meeting.